Salam, and welcome to the Logic of the Birds podcast. With me today to discuss the poetry of Ibn al Arabī are Professor Michael Sells, Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago, and Professor Hany Ibrahim of Calgary University in Alberta. Professor Sells, I'd like to start with you. You've recently published a new translation, lovely translation, of a collection of Ibn Arabī's poems, The Interpreter of Desires. I wanted to ask you, how did you first encounter Ibn al Arabī's poetry? What drew you to it?
I was studying Arabic poetry, classical Arabic poetry, pre-Islamic poetry, and I was also studying Sufism at the University of Chicago, kind of two different tracks. And then when I saw Ibn Arabī's Diwān, which I recently translate as the translator of desires, I felt that there was some extraordinary richness happening with the way that the classical Arabic poetic themes were being used in a way that wasn't always directly Sufi in the surface meaning, but which were clearly of vital importance for Ibn Arabī's development and thought, especially in the second part of his life.
And Professor Ibrahim, could you tell us, how did you first encounter Ibn Arabī's poetry? What drew you to it?
Actually, it was my father who introduced me to Ibn Arabī, even though he is not into Sufism, but the specific verse لقد صار قلبي قابلا كل صورة فمرعا لغزلان ودير لرهبان. My father memorized this, and at a young age, I knew he kept on repeating this verse, and he loved it so much. So I didn't know about Ibn Arabī, so I started reading the poetry of Ibn Arabī around 1993, after I finished my master's degree, and I began collecting Ibn Arabī's epistles, and I began reading about Ibn Arabī. So it was the verse, my heart has become capable of accommodating all forms, was the actual verse that hooked me into Ibn Arabī, Shaykh Muḥyī.
Wonderful. And that verse is from the translator of Desires, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. So it seems like that collection is what brought both of you into the wonderful world of Ibn al Arabī. So now I'd like to ask Professor Sells, could you give us a little bit of an introduction to Ibn Arabī's context and life? Where did he live? Where was he from? What do we know about his context that can help us kind of better understand his poetry? You said this poetry was particularly important in the second half of his life. What about his life, and how does that help us understand his poetry?
Ibn Arabī was born near Murcia in what is now Spain, and spent much of his youth being educated in Seville and Cordoba. His father was an official with military connections, and at some point he decided not to go into the court, and he had become interested in Sufis that he met, and gradually disassociated himself from the court, which was a complicated process. And then he set out for a lifelong itinerancy, where he would travel from city to city, meeting through networks of Sufis and Hadith scholars and poets. He traveled throughout Andalus, then Marrakesh and Fez were two centers of his life in his younger phase. Tunis, where he had some major mystical experiences that he recounts in his most famous book, the Meccan Openings, the Futuḥāt al-Makkiya. And finally, he made it to Mecca in the year 1202 of the Common Era. So that's 598 of the Islamic calendar. And this was a time when, just to give some historical background, Ibn Arabī's native Andalus was under pressure from the Reconquista. By the time he died, Cordoba would have been conquered by the Reconquista. The al-Muwahhidun dynasty that ruled from the Maghreb, which would have been both Morocco and as far as Tunisia sometimes and into Andalus, was really in its last days. By the time he went to Mecca, soon there would be the Fifth Crusade. St. Francis was walking around in Egypt attempting to solve the Crusades by converting Muslims. There was fighting throughout the area that he passed by in near Anatolia, especially Antioch. Only 15 years or so after his death, the Mongols conquered Baghdad. So it was the last florescence of the Abbasid Caliphate. And at this time, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad was very, very strongly supportive of Sufism. So there was an explosion of Sufi life and thought throughout the Eastern Arabic world.
And Professor Ibrahim, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the personal elements of Ibn Arabi's life? We know that this work, The Translator of Desires, was written kind of in response to an experience he had in Mecca with a young woman, Nidam. Can you tell us a bit more about that and the rest of Ibn Arabi's life?
Mainly, the originality of Ibn Arabi lies in his use of symbolism and his contextualization that he employed in his writing to portray and depict his personal and mystical spiritual experiences. And why he used this, he employed this cryptic symbolism and allusive style, as he said, to conceal divine knowledge from anyone who is outside the Sufi path. His main idea in his writings revolves around one major concept, and that is the concept known or translated as oneness of being, wahdat al-wujud. However, it's important to mention that Ibn Arabi did use a similar term. He did not use wahdat al-wujud or oneness of being. He rather used one term which is close to oneness in being. He used al-wahda fi al-wujud, oneness in being. He used it once in the second volume of the Futuḥāt al-Makkiya, and he says, I confirm multiplicity on confirmation, and disaffirm it from being, and confirm oneness in being, and disaffirm it from confirmation. So he says in Arabic, فَأَثْبِتُ الْكَثْرَةَ فِي الثُّبُوتِ وَأَنْفِهَا مِنَ الْوُجُودِ وَأَثْبِتُ الْوِحْدَةَ فِي الْوُجُودِ وَأَنْفِهَا مِنَ الثُّبُوتِ. Also in his chapter 178, when he was writing on the divine station of love, he uses in his introductory verses and poems to summarize his ideas in the first verses of his chapters in the form of poetry, and then he presents and discusses his ideas in further detail in the body of that same chapter. These introductory poems provide keys to deciphering the contents of his ensuing meditations. For example, he poetically declares at the beginning of chapter 178, for example, his idea of oneness of being. There is nothing except Him, God. There is only Him. He says in Arabic, وَلَيْسَ شَيْءٌ سِوَاهُ بَلْ هُوَ إِيَّاهُ. He also says it is correct to say that the perceived existence is God. فَصَحَّ أَنَّ الْوُجُودَ الْمُدْرَكَ اللَّهُ. Also he says, and nothing sees God except God, so apprehend in Arabic, فَلَا يَرَى اللَّهُ إِلَّا اللَّهُ فَاعْتَبِرُوا. Also he writes, I appeared to my creation in the image of Adam, ظَهَرْتُ إِلَى خَلْقِي بِصُورَةِ آدَمَ. So such declarations, which are of utmost importance, which Arabi describes his main ideas and main themes concerning Sufism and witnessing the oneness of God in creation. Like he says also, O you who appeared in himself to himself with no multiplicity, my being is annihilated. أيا من بدا في نفسه لنفسه ولا عدد فالعين مني فاني. So this is just an introduction to his concept, الوحدة في الوجود in the introduction. Also in the interpreter of longings, as you said, which he wrote in Mecca when he met Nizam in Mecca, he composed the interpreter of longings. And he was criticized by some jurists in Aleppo who disapproved of his poems, which were considered, according to them, unbefitting of a Sufi Shaykh. Also, he met a woman from Anatolia, which he wrote the explanation, the provisions of deep attachments in the explanation of the interpreter of longings, the Kha'ir al-A'laq, Sharh Turjuman al-Ashwaq. When he was criticized about these poems, he wrote himself a commentary explaining what he meant. And this explanation was a concise explanation of the deep, mystical, esoteric meanings concealed by his apparent erotic love poetry, and we will go and explain it further.
Thanks, Professor Ibrahim. Professor Sells, can you fill out the details of that story for us? Or how did this work, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, the translator or interpreter of desires, how did it come into being?
Oh, well, this remarkable work is a collection of 61 Arabic poems. And as Professor Hany was mentioning, Ibn al Arabī wrote them in honor of a young woman that was living in Mecca when he was there, with her father and her aunt, who were two scholars from Persia, living in Mecca and holding hadith sessions and scholarly sessions, majalis. And in one of his prefaces to the interpreter of desires, or the translator of desires, he gives a homage to this young woman, Nizam. Her name is significant because it can also be the beautiful arrangement of sound or of a necklace. I translate it as harmony. And the reason I do is he has references to Nizam throughout these 61 poems in different places. But very often they can read as just a common name, the harmony of, etc. So it's a play on that word. So not only was Nizam his inspiration, according to him, as it were his muse, she was his teacher. He calls her his teacher. And in many ways, he embodies her. The poems are an embodiment of her in some sense. And now, as Professor Hany mentioned, there's another story that he tells in the same preface or in a different preface. And this story is that he was, in the year 1202, he was at the Kaaba, the temple in Mecca, circumambulating the Kaaba for the rite of Umrah. And he drew aside from the major part of the circle to the periphery because a mood came upon him and some verses came to his mind. And he recited these verses. They're very, very simple love verses. And I'll just give the reader a taste of these 4 verses. So first I'll read it in English. I wish I knew if they knew whose heart they've taken, or my heart knew which high ridge track they follow. Do you see them safe or perishing? The lords of love are in love, ensnared, bewildered. Layta shi'ri hel darao ay qalbin malaku, wa fuadi law dara ay shi'bin salaku. Aturahum salimu am turahum halaku. Har arbab al-hawa fil hawa wartabaku. This simple verses he recited, he tells us, for himself and for anyone who might happen to have been nearby who wanted to listen, if anybody. And then he tells us he felt a touch on his back, a jolt, from hand as soft as silk, And when he turned around, there was a young woman there who called herself Qurrat al-Ayn, the cooling of the eye. And she proceeded to offer rigorous criticisms of each of the 4 verses. And when he got to the part about the lords of love are in love, ensnared, bewildered, she shouted out, "How can a true lover be bewildered? A true lover has no self left to be bewildered. His self has passed away in love for the beloved. So who is there to be bewildered?" And then he mentions that he would later see this young woman, and it's often been assumed that this young woman was Nizam who appeared there. I should mention that there was a tradition of appearances of young women. He calls her a jariya, that would be a maidservant or female slave. A whole tradition of jariyas at the Kaaba meeting great Sufis. And the Sufis often will rebuke the jariya for reciting love poems at the Kaaba. And then the jariya will come back and recite poetry, and it's a kind of battle of the minds, and the jariya comes out on as the one with more advanced knowledge in each case. And Ibn Arabī was relating these stories in another book of his called Sessions of the Righteous at about the time that he was composing Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. So you can see how these stories possibly influenced the literary imagination in the way he represents this encounter with the jariya at the Kaaba, who, like the other jariyas, has something to teach the famous male Shaykh.
That's wonderful. I didn't know about that tradition. This battle of wits and poetry. Is this how poetry, Ibn Arabi usually described poetry as coming to him, as kind of this inspiration where he had to step aside and write it down? Because, as Professor Ibrahim told us, his Futuḥāt is full of introductory poems and other poems. His Fuṣūṣ is full of other poems. A lot of his works have other poems as well too. How did he describe this poetic inspiration? Did it usually work in this way that you described, Professor Sells?
He has so many different comments on his poetry and so much poetry. I would have to say that most importantly for our hearers today, that major new work has been done on Ibn Arabi's poetry. And what used to be called his Diwān, his greater Diwān, we had known that through an edition made in the 19th century in Egypt called the Bulaq edition. But recent work has come out with thousands of other poems that have been tucked away in manuscripts and others that have completed the larger part of his great Diwān. One of these is a 4-volume set that has come out by a Moroccan scholar, Abdullahi bin Arafah, and the other one is a multiple volume set that was edited by Abdulaziz Sultan al-Mansub, a Yemeni scholar who's edited major works of Ibn Arabi over the past 20 years. Just imagine carrying out a life's work on Ibn Arabi's heritage during the civil war in Yemen and just going through and producing the finest scholarship. So both of these scholars, the Moroccan scholar and the Yemeni scholar, their works will be the basis of major new work going forward on the poetry of Ibn Arabi. So I just wanted to give out a shout to that. And he introduces his poems in such different ways. So, for example, in the Interpreter of Desires, first of all, he just had the poems, and then he wrote a commentary, as Professor Hany mentioned, when they were criticized, which was an allegorical reading of those love poems. He also had a long Diwān called Diwān al-Awārif, in which he introduces each love poem with phrases such as, "This occurred to me in the moment of such, with the inspiration of such," might be the moment of heart flash, with the inspiration of the spirit, various combinations. And so he gives a sense of the dynamic way that he viewed poetry as coming to him, and coming to him in specific moments of reflection and life.
Wow. And so much poetry did come to him. I mean, this greater Diwān that we now have of his, you said it's 4 volumes now in this edition with tens of thousands of poems.
Yes, I think tens of thousands of verses, up to 7,000 poems.
That's remarkable. All right, Professor Ibrahim, could you I want to make sure for our listeners that we get kind of the end of Ibn Arabi's life. So when we left him, he was in Mecca, and can you catch us up there? We know he goes to Anatolia for a while and eventually he passes away in Damascus. Can you take us through kind of the rest of his life?
After he left Andalusia or Spain, he went to Morocco, North Africa, Egypt, and then he went to Mecca and Iraq, Anatolia, and then settled in Damascus his final years, where he passed and is buried in Damascus. That's why the Meccan Openings, or al-Futuḥāt al-Makkiya, were completed 2 years before his death. Also, the poems in the Futuḥāt and his Diwān are a concise form containing his deep, mystical, esoterical experiences, and they were concealed by his apparent love poetry. For example, he writes, "I continue to compose the verses in this section to allude," and he uses the word ima, to allude throughout to divine inspirations, al-waridat al-ilahiyya, spiritual revelations, tanazzulat rabbaniyya, and elevated spiritual occasions, munasabat ulwiyya, in accordance with our ideal method of expression, the Sufi expression, whether it's prose or poetry or in writing. Also, I'd like to mention about the final verse, which attracted me to Ibn Arabi when he writes in poem number 11 of the Interpreter of Longings, "I profess the religion of love wherever its caravans turn. ad-Dīn bidīn al-ḥubbi anna tawajjahat rakā'ibuhu." This religion, or sometimes another, in his Diwān he uses this religion, فَالدِّينُ دِينِي, but the most famous verse, فَالْحُبُّ دِينِي, which is written in the Turjuman al-Ashwaq, and Ibn Arabi himself explained it. He said, "I profess the religion of love wherever its caravans turn. This religion, or love, is my religion, the faith I keep. ad-Dīn bidīn al-ḥubbi anna tawajjahat rakā'ibuhu. فَالدِّينُ دِينِي وَإِيمَانِي, or فَالْحُبُّ دِينِي وَإِيمَانِي." And because the original manuscript, as Professor Sells said, which was edited by Abd al-Ilah bin Arafah in Morocco, he writes the original manuscript versions written by Ibn Arabi of this verse was, "For religion is my religion and faith," while the other versions are not the popular published version in his Turjuman al-Ashwaq, which Ibn Arabi also explains why love, "For love is my religion and faith," فَالْحُبُّ دِينِي وَإِيمَانِي, which substituted the word religion for love. So you can use either both, and Ibn Arabi explained it in his ذخائر الأعلاق, which he commented on his own verse. He said, because the highest station which was bestowed on the Prophet Muhammad, who is known as al-Habib, maqam al-Hubb. So there is no higher form of love, higher form of expression, higher than the form of love of God, loving God. That's why this verse, many people might not understand it, but they feel the spiritual beauty of it when they read or recite it.
If I could add a couple comments to the very fine thoughts of Professor Hany on this religion of love. Ibn Arabi follows in a long succession of poets who declared the religion of love. One of them was the great Andalusian poet Ibn Zaydun, for example. Various poets proclaim the religion of love. And often in doing so, they integrate various aspects of Islam into their poetry. So there's Tawheed, the affirmation of oneness, will be then become, and the theology of Tawheed will get applied to the beloved. And the same paradoxes that come out with the affirmation of God's oneness come out with the affirmation of the beloved's uniqueness and oneness. She is beyond all description. She inhabits all forms, but is confined to none, etc. Ibn Arabī places the Hajj starkly at the very center of the Translator of Desires. And many of his most important poems take place at the Hajj. And he brings in all the various aspects of the stations on the way to Mecca, the stations in Mecca, the various sacrificial rites. And he also writes poems in the form of hadith. Number 14 in the Translator of Desires is an elaborate chain where the poet asks about his beloved, and an elaborate chain of emotions and states: despair, joy, sorrow, fire, relief, passed down word from the primordial beloved at the beginning of the history of the religion of love, a comment back to the poet on what his status is with the beloved. So this notion of the religion of love was not simply a sentimental thing, but it was thoroughly grounded in almost all the major aspects of Islamic thought and practice, but also done in a way, in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, done in a way that remains faithful to the classical Arabic poetic tradition, which involved primarily in these poems the remembrance of the lost beloved. So the poet puts himself into the world of pre-Islamic poets who would come across an abandoned campsite and then meditate on that abandoned campsite. And at some point, there's what I call a moment of recognition, where it's not just an abandoned campsite. It turns out to be the trace of the beloved's campsite, either the last time she and the poet were together or one of her campsites in her journey away from the poet when they broke up. And this moment of recognition sparks this poetic outpouring, as the poet is brought back in time to the time of the beloved. And I'd like to just give a brief example of how Ibn Arabī handles this theme. This is from poem number 24 in the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq. Ibn Arabī introduces it by saying, "A dervish recited a verse to me, the likes of which I'd never heard. And the verse is, 'All who sought you, you showered with graces. Only for me did your lightning flash faithless.'" He says, this verse struck me, and I composed verses using that rhyme. And you'll see that verse coming up in the fourth verse of this poem. I'll read the beginning of this poem with this theme of the abandoned campsite of the lost beloved being so prominent. "Stay at the ruins in Lala fading, and in that wilderness grieve for those we love. And at that campsite call out her name, your heart softly torn away. Oh, for the times passed near her moringa, picking her fruit, her garden's red rose. All who sought you, you showered with graces. Only for me did your lightning flash faithless. We used," she said, "to come together in my branches' shadows, in that lush land. My lightning, once a smile's flash, is now a blaze of barren stone. Blame time, relentless time. What fault was it of Lalai? I forgave her as I heard her speak, grieving as I grieved with a wounded heart. So these verses bring us into that classical Arabic world of the Nasib, the first part of the classical Arabic ode. They have this haunting evocation of the stations of the beloved. And in this case, either the beloved or the station of the beloved, which is called lalai in this poem, or the moringa tree, a beautiful tree in Arabia that was associated with the beauty and grace of the beloved. It's not clear who exactly is speaking back to the poet and saying, blame time, relentless time. What fault was it of lalai? But here one gets a sense of the pathos, the depth, and the acuteness of the sense of longing or desire, shauq, which is at the heart of Ibn Arabi's poems in the Interpreter of Desires, the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, but also key, as Professor Hany was mentioned, Ibn Arabi has a chapter on love in the Meccan Openings, chapter 178, and right next to it is the chapter on ma'arifa, or mystical knowledge. And these two aspects for Ibn Arabi are deeply entwined. We can see how essential this longing. I like to view the shauq in Ibn Arabi's poetry and his thought as a kind of propulsion, leading the seeker along the path in seeking the true or the real.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And beautifully translated, if I can add, by the way. That's absolutely wonderful. So it seems as if for Ibn Arabi that the love and knowledge go together, and love and poetry go together, and also knowledge and poetry go together as well, to at least marifah, this kind of knowledge that he's very concerned with transmitting through poetry. Professor Ibrahim, I wanted to ask you, do you have any favorite verses or poems other than the one you've already mentioned of Ibn Arabi's that you really appreciate or celebrate? And could you share them with us and tell them what makes them so outstanding?
As Professor Sells said, that Ibn Arabi's poetry, when he speaks about the beloved, and he uses these female heroines, because for him, whether it's Nidam or Qurrat al-Ain or any beloved figure, he sees them as a theophany, a manifestation. He witnesses God in them, and he considers and sees them as a perfect embodiment of divine beauty, love, and knowledge. So when he speaks about witnessing or shuhud, two things come from this witnessing or shuhud: a hal, a state, a spiritual state, and knowledge. So knowledge and witnessing, when you witness the beauty of the beloved, a spiritual hal state comes to you, and also knowledge from that hal, which is the ma'rifah. He uses also in his other verses the different phases on the spiritual path to the self-realization and witnessing of God in everything as the manifestation. So, for example, many people might not understand such verses. For example, he says, بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَزْدَادُ الذُّنُوبِ. By mentioning God, your sins increase. بذكر الله تزداد الذنوب وتنطمس البصائر والقلوب, and your insights are blurred. تنطمس البصائر والقلوب, and the hearts. Why? He's speaking here about something else. بذكر الله تزداد الذنوب وتنطمس البصائر والقلوب وترك الذكر, and leaving dhikr, remembrance, mentioning God. وترك الذكر أفضل منه. It's better than mentioning God. Why? Because the sun never sets. So he's speaking here about something else. If someone reads it superficially or from the apparent meanings of his verse, a person might say, why? Mentioning God, your sins increase. He's talking about something else. He's talking about opening in the witnessing of God. Al-Fath, thumma shuhud. So he's speaking about dhikr here is like knocking on the door. بذكر الله. Okay, is knocking on the door. So if the door opens and you enter the hadra, you don't stand in front of the door and keep knocking on the door. Here it's a sin. When the door opens after you knock, after you mention, enter and witness the hadra, the presence of God. It's silence. So dhikr here is considered a sin for the Gnostics, for the Arifin who witness God. The hadra or the presence of God is silence, witnessing through the heart. بِذِكْرِ اللَّهِ تَزْدَادُ الذُّنُوبَ تَنْطَمِسُ الْبَصَائِرُ وَالْقُلُوبُ, because you cannot see. Okay, if you keep mentioning and knocking on the door while the door is open, you cannot see or witness the. وَتَرْكُ الذِّكْرِ أَفْضَلْ مِنْهُ. So leaving dhikr here is much better. Why? Because the presence of God never sets. It's like the sun, never sets. So do not read literally into Ibn Arabi's verses or poems, but read behind and between the lines, the spiritual meanings which Ibn Arabi himself has tasted. Also, similarly, if someone has experienced such spiritual experiences, ma'rifah or gnosis, witnessing God, can understand the verses of Shaykh Muḥyī ibn Arabi. That's why many scholars, such Imam al-Suyuti and Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, many scholars said he's one of the greatest Gnostics in all times, but it's forbidden to read his poems or books because people who are not experienced or versed in such a field may misunderstand what Ibn Arabi is trying to say. That is why you need a guide, a spiritual guide, or someone who's versed in these meanings and verses of Ibn Arabi.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Professor Sells, you have something to add?
Yes, a couple thoughts. First, on the process of poetry and reflection on the poetry. Many times Ibn Arabi presents poems, as we talked about, coming to him in a flash, or a verse coming to him in a flash. And he talks about the spiritual and emotional context for that moment. And then when he writes his own commentary on the poems of the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, he reads those poems in a way that is not completely clear from the context. So he provides a backstory so that the lover and the beloved not only represent these figures within the nasib part of the classical Arabic poem, but their romance is related directly to Ibn Arabi's cosmology, his metaphysics, his a wide variety of thoughts. And in the commentary, and also in one of his later works, The Bezels of Wisdom, Fusuṣ al-ḥikam, he has a vision of love as the creative heart of the universe. And he talks about, in the last chapter of the Bezels of Wisdom on Muhammad, he actually talks about how creation is brought about simultaneously by the longing of the creator to create and the longing of the creature to be created. And that comes out, he mentions in the Quranic phrase, all God has to do is say be, and it is. But there's a paradox in that Quranic phrase. Who hears the expression be before they exist? How can they hear the expression if they don't yet exist? And that tension of Shaykh as a creative force that is constantly moving through the world, constantly both creating and also annihilating. And that brings us to another point that Professor Hany mentioned. How does this heart that is receptive of every form come about? And for Ibn Arabi, the manifestations of the divine are constantly changing because the infinite cannot be held in one form over time. So the forms of the divine are constantly changing. And when the poet or the Sufi gets to a point of intensity of shaykh or longing to where the self of the poet or Sufi is annihilated in mystical union with God. That is at the heart of this receptivity of the heart. And Ibn Arabī mentions that point of mystical union in connection with the famous hadith of the nawafil, or supererogatory devotions, which states that, in the words of God, when I see my servant approaching me through required ritual actions and through those that aren't required, supererogatory, I love him, and when I love him, I become the hearing with which he hears, the seeing with which he sees, the feet with which he walks, the hands with which he touches, and in some versions, the tongue with which he speaks. So it's as if the shell of the Sufi or devotee is now taken over by the divine seer, hearer, and speaker. But that moment cannot be held in time. In every moment, Ibn Arabī says, if one tries to hold on to that moment, to possess it, as it were, one is left with the empty husk of an experience. And that can be a kind of idolatry, to hold on to one manifestation and never change. And the goal is to have a moment in each breath, giving up the images that one had, becoming annihilated again in love for the divine beloved, and then being able to receive a new manifestation. I'd like to read just the first verses of the poem that Professor Hany has been mentioning, the famous one ending with, "My heart has become receptive of every form," and to mention again how longing is related to this receptivity. And this takes place in a grove of springberry and moringa, two plants associated with the beloved in classical Arabic poetry. It starts out with a scene of doves called "Gentle Now Doves." Allah ya hamamat al-arakati wal-bani tarafakna la tudifna bishajwi ashjani tarafakna la tuthirna binakhi wal-buka khafiya sababati wa maknuna ahzani. Gentle now, doves of the springberry and moringa, don't add your sighs to my heartache. Gentle now, lest your sad cooing show the love I hide, the sorrow I seal. I echo in the evening I echo back, in the morning echo the longing of the lovesick and lost. Spirits moan in the ghada trees, bending branches over me as I pass away. So in these four verses, one has the dialogue with the doves. The doves are mourning their lost ones, just as Ibn al Arabī is mourning his. And within this context, the spirits are moaning in these ghada trees, a tree Ibn Arabī associates with fire, bending the branches over him. And then we have this moment where the poet-lover passes away in fana, or mystical union.
Wow, very beautiful. Thank you so much for the beautifully described cosmology and the process of kind of spiritual wayfaring and journeying, and the importance of longing and receptivity therein. So he's describing this in poetry, but what's the role of poetry here if it isn't to try to hold on to that state or experience? What is he doing with poetry? Why does he turn to poetry so often? We heard Professor Ibrahim, he said he uses it in part to try to conceal things from those perhaps unworthy or not ready to hear it, but it seems like there's something else going on here with poetry and Ibn Arabī and the way he's using it. Professor Ibrahim, do you want to take a crack at that and help us understand how he's using poetry, why he's using poetry in this way?
I think because of the beauty of the Arabic poetry, as Professor Sells said, the nasib, it's like music. You capture the beauty of the music in time. So I think poetry does the same. The musicality of the poetry, the rhythmic music of the verses, they capture the beauty in time. So every time you hear these verses, it manifests in front of you as if you witness the beloved. You remember and you encapsulate that precious moment. You capture it in time, and it's manifested in poetic structure and verses. And also I'd like to add a comment on Professor Sells when he mentioned the hadith of the supererogatory prayers, hadith al-Nawafil. The Arabic says God does not become, it's not a metamorphosis, but actually the Arabic says kuntu sam'ahu, I am the hearing by which he or she hears. I am the sight. So he's the sight, he's the hearing, he's the hand. So they call it raf' al-hujub, the lifting of the veils from the heart. God is not veiled. He's never veiled. One of his names is al-Zahir, the most apparent than appearance itself. So human beings are veiled from witnessing him. So what happens? The veils of the heart are lifted and people come to witness God. So it's a self-realization more than becoming more or uniting with. It's realizing the oneness of existence. That's why this moment is captured in the poetic verses of the Sufis. For example, also Shaykh Umar ibn al when he says, أبرق بدا من جانب الغور لامع أم ارتفعت عن وجه ليلى البراقع. He's speaking about the lifting of the veils, and he uses the name Layla, for describing his witnessing of God, the essence of God. And they use also lightning. These are known in Sufi terminology as al-Bawariq. And these lightning Bawariq, which the Sufi beginner experiences, are inviting that Sufi to tread the path of self-realization, where at the end, as the hadith says, فَإِذَا أَحْبَبْتُ, when I love him or her, I am the hearing by which he or she hears. So it's the realization that nothing exists in you except the existence of God. It's the existence of God himself. It's not you.
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, so God is saying, I was your sight, your hearing, your hand, your foot, all along.
Yes.
All along.
I am.
I am.
The hadith in Arabic says, kuntu sam'ahu.
Thank you for that lovely exposition of that implications of that famous hadith. I wanted to reflect also on what Professor Hany said regarding the phrase beauty of music in time, and reflect on time and go back to the question that Professor Ogunaike raised. That is, how can one avoid taqyid? Taqyid is the hanging on to, the delimitation, the binding of meaning. And Ibn al Arabī says when a human being binds the infinite reality in a particular form, it becomes, as I mentioned, just a husk. How to avoid that binding, to become open to a new form in every moment? I think Ibn al Arabī's own understanding of poetry suggests that these verses came to him in that process, which you might call taqallub, a constant transformation of the consciousness of the poet Sufi. So the consciousness is in constant transformation, just as the consciousness of the divine is in constant transformation, or the manifestations of the divine are in constant transformation, as I mentioned. So Ibn Arabī, when he wrote his commentary on the Tarjuman al-Ashwaq, it's clear from the writing and comments he makes in the commentary that these are momentary reflections on the verses that he's writing about in his commentary. Elsewhere, when he writes about some of the same poems, he introduces or reflects on them in a different way than he does in the commentary. My sense is that if one takes any particular commentary, it can be used to offer a flash of insight. But if one takes the commentary and says that's all these poems mean, then one misses the chance to have another flash of insight reflecting back on the poems, or one misses the chance to find out what Ibn Arabī said elsewhere about these verses, or something similar to them. So the relationship between the inspiration of the poetry and the reflection upon it is very closely related to the relationship between shawq, longing, and ma'rifah, or mystical intuition.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so the poems keep giving, they keep flowing, they keep transforming even as they come out of transformation. In another episode, we talked about Ayn al-Qudat Tamadani, and he said poetry or poems, verses are like mirrors. They can be used to show all kinds of things in different contexts. And someone was arguing with him and said, oh, that's not what the poet intended. He said, that's like saying a mirror only shows the face of the person who made the mirror. So poetry is like this. It can show all kinds of things in this, ever transforming way. That's wonderful. Thank you.
And your point about intention is quite interesting, because if verses come to Ibn Arabī in a flash at a certain moment in time, then clearly he's constantly moving through these stations. And sometimes I think we can get caught up in the poet's intention. Did Ibn Arabī intend the various meanings when he composed the poems? Did he intend all the meanings that he has later unfolded in his commentary on the poems? My sense is that if the verses come from a moment of spontaneity, the question of the author's intention is latent, and then the author might go back and comment on the poems and reflect on them in different ways at different times, and gradually unpack various meanings from them.
I'd like to add something. This is an excellent comment from Professor Sells. Also, from my readings from the Sufis, and specifically Shaykh Muḥyī, this is exactly the point. The more you read, when you keep repeating and reading, many openings come to you when you read. So his poetry also is the same. That's why he keeps on repeating and uses the Quranic verse, كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. It means that every day, literally every day, but every instant or every moment, there's a changing divine manifestation at each and every instant. So by reading his poetry or his books or his writings, every time you read them again over and over again, new meanings open up. That's why the Sufis said, they asked, who is higher? Al-Mutalawwin, a person who is witnessing the constant change, or Al-Mutamakkin, who is in spiritual capacity. So Shaykh Muḥyī said, the major Sufis says no, Al-Mutamakkin. But the major Sufis, Shaykh Muḥyī says no, Al-Mutalawwin. Why? Because he's experiencing at every instant a different manifestation all the time. So excellent point, Professor Sells explained. Yes, the more you read, the more new meanings open up for the reader.
Yes, no, wonderful. And as you said, Ibn Arabī for himself, he's not reaching a final destination, but
there is no end.
There's no end. It's this kind of perpetual circling or spiraling as well, too, which, at least for me, when I read the poems and I read the way he deploys the verses in different places, different ways, I get the same kind of at least for me anyway, bewildering, spiraling, and circling perpetual movement through them. I wanted to ask you, though, there are all of these kind of visionary experiences he has that are related to poetry. So, and they're described in a few articles by people. So there's this one with this hair that comes out of his chest, and it's related to Surah Ash-Shu'ara of the Quran. And you know, the word for hair and the word for poetry in Arabic, sha'ar and shir, come from the same root. There's this kind of trippy image of a ship made of stone floating across the desert.
And shu'ur, feeling.
And shu'ur, feeling, feeling, intuition kind of sense. There's this image you have of a ship going across the desert. There's something else where he ascends into the heavens and he hears this 2-on-3 beat, and it's the pens writing the deeds of everybody. And he asks, "What's this sound?" And he's told it's poetry. If you're familiar with these accounts of his visions, what do they tell us about, you know, what Ibn Arabi thinks about poetry and how he uses it? There are articles on this, but it's, especially for the lay reader, it's very confusing. What does poetry have to do with a ship going across the desert, with a hair coming out of your chest, with styluses tapping out, you know, 2-on-3 polyrhythm? If you can comment on those and help us make sense of those. Maybe Professor Sells, you want to go first, and then Professor Ibrahim, you can help us.
Well, Professor Claude Adas has written about that image of the hair / poetry in an article. And I don't think I can relate to all his different poems. Again, I read that as a comment on a particular experience that he had of poetry as such, a kind of encounter with poetry as such.
I just also remembered something like the many Sufi scholars, when they say the surah, the chapters of the Quran, the first letters such as Alif Lam Mim summarize the whole or the secret of the chapters of the Quran. Kaf, Ha, Ya, Ayn, Sad, Ha, Mim, Ayn, Sin, Qaf. So similarly, when you read the poetry of the greatest Shaykh, Sidi Muḥyī, okay, and any other Sufi Shaykh, when you read, meanings come out similar to when you read the Quran, because the reciter and the composer, the narrator and the listener are one. When Professor Sells said that when God told to the things, قال للأشياء, when he says إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون. So where are the أشياء? Where are the entities? The entities are in God's knowledge. So he's speaking to them in his knowledge to come out and to appear. That's why when Sidi Muḥyī, when he spoke about الأعيان الثابتة, so everything is inside the knowledge of God. Everything that you imagine, like poetry, how does it come out? It's inside you. Okay, so when it's being composed, it's like the entities of creation coming out from inside your knowledge to the outside. So when you keep reading and reciting them, meanings continue to open up, and there is no end to these meanings. It's similar to the recitation of the Quran. The more you read, the more you elevate in knowledge. The more you elevate in knowledge, the more you love God. So how you cannot gain this knowledge and elevate in knowledge by loving you. The more you know God, the more you love Him. The more you love Him, the more you know about Him. So it's a continuing circle. So similarly, the writings of the Shaykh Sidi Muḥyī, whether it's his writings in his books, his epistles, or in his poetry, they keep elevating you. The more you read, like the opening which came to Professor Sells, new meanings come up. It's never ending. It's never ending. That's why I'm enjoying this talk now. We don't want it to end, because new knowledge is coming. We're gaining new knowledge, and the more knowledge, the more you love learning about God, the more. So this is the beauty of it.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. You reminded me of, I can't remember the exact quote, but Ibn Arabi said something like, all of the world is endowed with rhythm and fastened by rhyme on the straight path. Like when Arabic and poetry is written, it's written, the two misras are written on the straight line. So it says, if the world is God's speech and poetry is ordered speech, and the Quran says that God created everything biqadr, and with order, with measure, then the whole world is, in a sense, a poem. And like some English poets say, that's why they call it a universe, because it's one verse.
One, yes.
it's one verse.
So it seems to me, I love to listen to classical music, so I don't listen to the composer, the specific composer, or to the players or the music. I'm listening to the greatest composer and the player and the listener. So the composer, the players, and the listeners are one.
Beautiful. Is there something, because Ibn Arabi also wrote a lot of prose as well too, but his prose is peppered with poetry. As you said, the poetry often kind of condenses and synthesizes what's going on in his prose. Can you comment on how he uses poetry and prose differently? Is poetry kind of synthetic and the prose kind of more analytic and discursive? Or why does he sometimes choose poetry, sometimes prose, sometimes diagrams? What's he doing with these different forms of expression?
In both the Meccan Openings and the Bezels of Wisdom, Ibn Arabi has a kind of poem that is not the one that I've been focusing on, in which the poem serves as a kind of talisman. It locks, and then the rest of the chapter, Ibn Arabi often says, is unlocking the meanings that are in this extremely condensed form within the poem. And that gives, again, I think it gives a kind of particular dimension to his writing, so that you have the poetic, condensed, intuitive language, and then the analysis of it, and they're always talking back, they're in conversation with one another continuously. And some of Ibn Arabi's, what we call prose writing, is extremely poetic. I would say that the Bezels of Wisdom has a very poetic writing style, even when it is, and it's always verging between a more poetic style and a more analytic style based on the language of philosophers like Ibn Sina and others to whom Ibn Arabi was responding in that work.
Well, I think then we can turn to now the legacy of Ibn al Arabī, which is almost as difficult and as vast to talk about as his poetic. But could you tell us a little bit about the contemporary life and legacy of Ibn al Arabī's poetry, in particular? Is it still sung today? Do people still read it? If so, who reads it? Who sings it? Who likes to listen to it? Professor Sells, we'll start with you.
My understanding is that two poets that were contemporary of Ibn Arabi, who composed a similar type of love poems, Ash-Shushtari and Ibn al-Farid, those poems are very often sung and have anchored themselves within various musical traditions. Ibn Arabi's poems, I think some of them are a little dense to be good song lyrics. There's too much packed into them, although there have been some marvelous recordings of Ibn Arabi's poetry. The group As-Safafir has put Ibn Arabi's poetry to music and sung it in a truly extraordinary way. And there are groups in Morocco and Spain that perform Ibn Arabi's poetry, and those CDs are available. I think the last 30 years have seen a resurgence of interest in Ibn Arabi, proliferation of studies, of scholarship, and I think more and more people now are coming back to his poetry within the Islamic world.
Wonderful, thank you. Professor Ibrahim, Anything to add to it? Can you tell us about the...
I think also a very important Shaykh Sidi Abdul Ghani in Nabulsi. Many of his poems similar to Shaykh Muḥyī, because the main idea of Ibn Arabi's poetry, and specifically the Arifuna Billah, or the Gnostics, is on God. Unlike, for example, the poems by Imam al-Busiri, which praised the Prophet Muhammad and mentioned the characteristics and beauty of the Prophet Muhammad. But the poems of these Gnostics, the great Arifuna Billah, focus on God and the presence of God, Hadra wa Shuhud. So I heard also many in Syria verses which have been recited in the Hadarat. For example, Buruq al-Barqi Lamma'a. He's speaking about the Hadra. So Sheikh Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, I think, also has been his poems have been recited a lot in the main Sufi circles.
Now, I remember when I went to the Sheikh Muhyiddin's mosque in Damascus, and they had a hadra there. And I don't know if it was just because it was his mosque where he was buried, but they were singing and reciting some of his poetry as well too, as well as those of Shushtari, Ibn Farid, Abdul Ghani Nablusi, and al-Haraq as well too.
Yes, this is al-Sama', which they mention, al-Sama' Sufi, which incites desires and passion and longing, and as I said, they instate spiritual states. So when you hear them, you go into a spiritual state of hal, and then I remembered something when I was at the University of Calgary. I had a scholar who was a colleague, and he had a student who asked him about the Sufis when they mention wine and the drinking. So he came and asked me, do Sufis drink wine? I told him, of course not. It's a form of expression, mentioning God. It begins with al-Dhawq, ثم الشرب, ثم الري, ثم السكر. It says states of when mentioning God al-Hadra, and then you enter into the presence. It begins like tasting, and then you begin to drinking, then you quenching, and then you become intoxicated and enter into the Hadra.
One thing I wanted to add on to our discussion was a thought about mystical pairs. So we talked a little bit about Nizam and Ibn Arabi. Other examples of mystical pairs, these are would be Meister Eckhart and Marguerite Porete. So it's not clear that they knew each other personally, but their works comment on one another in very, very powerful ways. A famous example is John of the Cross and St. Teresa of Avila. So John of the Cross bears very interesting comparisons with Ibn Arabi. He lived a couple of centuries after Ibn Arabi, but he composed a Diwān of very passionate love poems, and then he wrote massive commentaries on them. And for many years, he was primarily known through his commentaries. People would read the commentaries and find his mystical theology. But then, more recently, people have also been going back and appreciating the poems as love poems. Of course, Teresa of Avila was very much under his support and influence, and some of her erotic mystical visions, of course, have become iconic in Western civilization. And then, of course, there's Shams Tabriz and Rumi. So you have this sense of, it's not just that the beloved as a woman or a man stands in for God, but there also seems to be a clear relationship between human love at its highest form and the love of the divine. And those two things are constantly interacting with one another. You could say that they're refining one another, as it were.
Yeah, and in the perspective of Ibn Arabi's cosmology, really, you can't really separate the two. It's not like there's divine love. I mean, you can do it kind of mentally or heuristically, but it's not like there's divine love over here and there's human love over here and there's this other kind of love over here. It's all one reality. It's all one reality, which is why I think even though Ibn Arabi's poems have this reputation for being very dense, they work really well as love poems. The love poems work very well as love poems, as you know, it's typical of these Sufi love poems. They kind of work on every level. They work on kind of boy-girl love. They work on various other stages. It's kind of remarkable. They kind of.
I think because al-Muthanna at-Tathniya here, in order for you to be a lover, there has to be a beloved.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So that is why that number 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At-Tathniya. It's like the mirror. In order to see your face, you have to have a mirror.
Right. Exactly. And there's something about, I think Ibn Arabi at another place said that a human being can only be fully extinguished or encompassed in love for another human being or for God. Yes. You can't be you can't have fana in love for your iPhone, or maybe for pets.
I think some people are working on it.
Yeah, they've disappeared into the phone. I'm sure Apple would love that, but that's according to Ibn Arabi, that's not the way we're made. But no, there does seem to be something very intense, like I think this is also in the end of the Fuṣūṣ, where he talks about the most intense shuhud, witnessing of the divine, takes place in the union of love, in the actual act of love making, and he has a kind of beautiful poems at the beginning and the end of that as well too.
It's because the names, the Asma al-Jalal and Asma al-Jamal, yani Asma al-Jamal, the manifestation of the beautiful names in the female, and the manifestation of the majestic names in the form of the male. So the union between Asma al-Jalal and Asma al-Jamal produce Adam and Eve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so... Well, thank you very much, Professor Sells and Professor Ibrahim, for this delightful conversation about Ibn al Arabi's poetry, about longing, about love and marifa, knowledge, and the kind of nature of poetry and what it does for us and does to us. Thank you very, very much.